Subaru. Whoa! Ah! The feeling of floating that lasted for a moment, and the pain from being caught by the firm, solid ground. Knowing that he was going to fall, although he curled up his body and rolled forward to soften his landing, it was still quite the impact. The follow-up attack from the thick branch that laid on the spot where he tumbled down was especially beyond what he expected. It dug against his shoulder blades, and the unanticipated pain made his eyes water. Ow, ow, ah. I'm glad there weren't any follow-up attacks other than from Mother Nature, thanks to my knife. Standing up while teary-eyed, Subaru sighed after he returned the knife in his hands back into its sheath. He then spun around to gaze up at the trunk of the large tree, which he had been dangling from until now. A long vine extended towards the ground from one of the thick branches of the trunk. It was cut off in the middle by the knife, but beyond the severed vine was Subaru. A ring. I've seen those before in stuff like manga, but these kind of traps actually work, huh? Saying so, Subaru removed the vine that was looped around and tied around his right ankle. The trap was set up on the ground, and it had a function where it tightened itself around one's foot should they try to pass above it, leaving the person suspended in mid-air. To be honest, even though Subaru fell for the trap, he had no idea how it was able to make that possible. And he also didn't have the spare time to search for this and that in order to find out the answer, either. Subaru. Although she doesn't have her memories, her knowledge and skill are left as they are. When I'm in the position of chasing after her like this, I see Rem really is Nisama's little sister. It was already obvious from the start, but he was forcefully reminded of it yet again. Of course, he didn't want it to be pointed out to him in this manner, so it felt quite unpleasant to him. Over an hour had passed since Subaru entered the forest in pursuit for Rem. Following the advice of the masked man, who he met on the other side of the forest, Subaru was able to detect Rem's attempts to disguise the escape route she used with Louis in tow. Thanks to it, he could undoubtedly say that the distance between him and the two was shrinking. However, the greatest factor of why he wasn't able to close the distance to zero was because Rem's wariness was his biggest obstacle. Rem was cautious of the witch's scent, the miasma that encircled him, not limiting herself to only camouflaging her and Louis' footsteps, but also placing traps everywhere around the forest to slow him down. Ever since he received the powerful blow at the beginning of all this, Subaru discovered, or, well, you could say he fell for, traps that amounted to a number above 10. Knowing Rem was carrying out the positioning of these number of traps while running on her unsteady legs, taking a dead weight with her to add to that, Subaru had to be deeply impressed by her. Subaru. If it's something like tying some grass or digging a shallow pitfall, it's actually cute, but minor traps with the purpose of tripping him or spraining his foot. If it came to those kind of traps, it wasn't as harmful, and it also wasn't as much of a hindrance to his continuation of tracking Rem down. However, there was a abnormally high number of these traps, and it was troublesome because he needed to be on the lookout for them when he navigated the areas with lots of grass and fallen leaves. Subaru. It's difficult for me when, with Rem's strength, it takes one try for her to make a pit that only traps one of your legs. The difference between our abilities we were born with is really showing. Mingled among the minor traps were intermediate traps made of the vines and fallen trees, similar to the one that pulled him into the air, fully aiming to slow him down. If Subaru hadn't been blessed with the opportunity to obtain a knife by some miracle, how much time would it have taken him to free himself from the vine trap? There was also the likelihood of the recommencing of his chase being delayed even further, due to losing his cool in one way or another. And what made the panicking Subaru hesitate the most was shit. He lashed out the guilty whip he drew from the back of his waist, the tip of the weapon delivering a powerful strike to the suspicious spot on the ground. The next moment, aimed towards the spot, 2 or 3 branches swooped down onto it, rebounding through the air with a devastating amount of power. It had a force that would be strong enough to break 1 or 2 of his arms, if he had been hit directly by those. Large traps, which existed to seize Subaru's ability to take action. There weren't many, but the fact that these traps had been indeed set up was hampering the speed he was advancing through the forest at. He could also say the single blow he received from the thick branch at the entrance was one of Rem's large traps. As Subaru continued deeper into the forest, the danger and power of these large traps was increasing. Instead of thinking that Rem, being chased, was losing her mercifulness, it was clear that her skill was growing. Subaru. She's learning and getting even better at making traps, whilst creating during her escape. Damn. As expected of how hard-working you are, Rem. I didn't want it to be demonstrated right now against me, though. He knew Rem was a hard worker, who tried her best at everything, and he was also happy those qualities weren't lost, even in the present situation where her memories haven't returned. However, that was beside the point. To put it short, Rem was growing throughout their battle. Considering Subaru's own growth was pretty much at its limit, to make matters worse, the already severe difference in their capabilities could be even more noticeable. He had to capture her before this difference became set in stone, but... Subaru... Dismantling the large trap in front of him, Subaru held his breath for a moment. Restlessly, glancing around the area around him, what he seeked after was the next escape route of Rem, who had created the trap he just took apart. In order to find it out, there was a need to follow the little amount of tracks she tried to cover up. Of course, he could think of a situation where she left no traces behind at all, but the current Rem didn't have the ability nor the time to pull that off. Because of that, found it. In the gap between the trees, where the trap was previously set up, Subaru discovered the sign of tree bark having been plucked out, albeit only a little. It was unrelated to the large trap, and it was a tiny scratch that was similar to a cat dragging its claws against a pillar of a house. However, these childish scars had served a purpose in leading Subaru to this point. After all, the true identity of these scratches were the tracks left behind by the hindrance. It was an ironic thing, but the primary factor that got in Rem's way and allowed Subaru to continue his pursuit was the existence of the Sin Archbishop she was taking with her on her escape, Louis Arneb. Rem and Louis. Subaru didn't know how compatible they were with each other, but what he could observe from the little scars was that Louis wasn't very well behaved and cooperative with Rem's actions. No matter how hard Rem tried to erase their footsteps, Louis was ruining all her efforts. Shit. Taking notice of the good news as Subaru used it to assist his chase, his feelings remained cloudy, the rays of revitalization refusing to shine through them. It was only natural. With it resulting in Louis' existence giving Subaru a helping hand, if he thought about his relationship with the evil Archbishop of Gluttony, he couldn't be rejoicing over it. Even if it wasn't Louis who directly stole Rem's name and memories, the three siblings, representing gluttony, all bore sins to an equal degree. Only one of them having a weight of their sins lightened was something that wasn't going to happen. It didn't matter if she didn't have a physical body that existed in the world, or if she strayed off the correct path in her way of life. That was the conclusion Subaru made against Louis Arneb, who had been ranting, screaming, and bawling her eyes out in that white-filled world. Because of that, even if Subaru could catch up to Rem successfully, and enter the stage of persuading her, he had no intention to make a compromise on how Louis would be treated. In the first place, why the hell do I have to play tag with Rem like this? As he thought about catching up to Rem and discussing what they would do about Louis, Subaru bit his lip out of the anger rushing back into him, despite leaving it out of his mind until now. He had considered the possibility of awakened Rem having lost her memories and name. Of course, it would have been the best if the original complete Rem had returned, but since there were previous cases such as Crush and Julius, he couldn't really expect Rem to wake up in her former state. His worries had nailed the problem right in the centre, and as a result, Rem had forgotten about herself, as well as Subaru. Even if things turned out like that, Subaru thought he could withstand it and support her. Amelia and Ram beached on the others, with the members of the camp helping each other out. Everyone could support Rem together. That was the source of why Subaru could stay put. However, right now in the forest with none of those people Subaru could rely on, he was in pursuit of the runaway Rem. Why did it turn out like this? Why does everything always? didn't allow him to settle down anything neatly and smoothly. Rem would wake up after remembering everything, and although she would be surprised at the time that had passed during her slumber, they would weave the story that laid ahead of them together. He was fine with that. Even if Rem were to be in the same state she was currently in, if Subaru's allies would do all their best together as a group, were there for her and stood by her side, then he wouldn't have been tormented by a disaster like this. He was fine with that too. Fate had always had the harshest, cruelest path in store for Natsuki Subaru. And not only did it prepare that for Subaru, but it also directed that towards the people around him, who were dear to him. Have you complained enough already, Natsuki Subaru? Gnashing the back of his teeth together, Subaru delivered a strong slap to his cheeks, using both of his hands. The sharp pain in the impact rocked his consciousness, and Subaru temporarily left behind the feeble thoughts he had been harbouring until now. Yes, fate invariably showed him the cruelest path every single time. That was why Natsuki Subaru was constantly beaten down by hardship and suffering in the form of a whip, standing up every time he fell, despite feeling like he was on the verge of vomiting up blood, and continued to face the front. Subaru, the man who finally made his hardships into his own whip, that's me. Strictly speaking, Guilty Lao, the witch beast that became the raw materials for the whip, was not quite a wall that obstructed his path, and it was on the lower difficulty level among those other hardships that blocked his way. Subaru declared it as such. Talking big and lifting his own spirits, stirring up his own emotions, concentrating his crafty mind and searching for the way he could fight. It was what Subaru had been doing up until now. He had been following through with it to a foolishly honest degree. He didn't have any other way to do it, so he would do the same for today as well. Think, me. Even if I keep chasing after Rem, she'll eventually realise that Louis is screwing up her plan. If that happens, then the tracks will be cut off sooner or later. Before that happens, he either had to catch up with them or figure out a way to forestall them. Analysing the difference in their fighting strength, Subaru racked his brains with all his might, trying to pinpoint the strengths of both the opponent party and himself. As of now, Rem's strengths were her dexterity and her attractiveness, things which weren't lost even if she didn't have her memories. He wanted to watch over the speed of her growth as she became more adept at setting traps, the cuteness of her face and voice, and how she was taking actions, but those could wait. On the contrary, Subaru's strength were his handling of the whip and knife, the clues Louis was leaving behind for him, although it was vexing to think she was helping him, and regarding the mean-looking shape of his eyes as part of his charm. He could point out that he knew what kind of person Rem was, even more so than Rem herself. Rem must have already noticed me chasing after her. The existence of the countless traps proved it, but Rem had been guessing that Subaru was hot on her heels. If not, there was no reason for her to prepare an excessive number of traps to this extent. She would have only placed a few traps just to be safe, and prioritised her escape. Instead of doing so, she continued to set up various traps because she was certain that Subaru was after her, and the reason why she would be so sure was because of the witch's miasma. Exactly how much does my body stink right now? Subaru sniffed his arm, but while he could not detect the scent of it, he could detect the scent of sand and sweat only. Of course, people said it was hard to notice your own smell, but in this case, the problem was the witch's miasma being only able to be recognised by certain people. Previously, he heard something about the scent fading away day by day from Rem and Beatrice, but it would drastically increase its putridity, depending on if it was right after he returned by death, or if he used it constantly. And in half a day, Subaru's looping in the watchtower had piled up approximately twice as many Natsuki Subarus, and he was then hurled to a place like this. That meant, in the history of my life in this world, the man who reeks of the witch the most is the current me. It was unknown whether there was a limit to the witch's miasma or not, but Subaru could guess that the current him was emitting a substantial amount of it. If it's the case, then his pursuit had definitely been found out already. When it becomes so that Rem was unable to keep the distance between them despite continuing to run and escape, she would eventually grow impatient. Usually, teasing his opponent and leading them to make an error was a common trick of Subaru's, but he also wanted to make a new friendly relationship with Rem, so he didn't want to rely on deceiving her too much. Something's good on one side will be bad to the other. It's impossible to appease us both. The fact that the saying was being carried into real life showed how bad the current situation was in a straightforward manner. Thinking it as such, Subaru deactivated 2 or 3 minor intermediate traps, chasing after the route Rem took while following the clues left by Louis. He generally felt like Hansel and Gretel, who picked up crumbs of bread as they made their move. However, the difference was Subaru being alone, and also the group of 2 being the ones on the run. Subaru, and it's pretty obvious place this time. Next is discovering the stripped bark of tree. Subaru determined the next path he would be taking. Louis didn't intend to let Subaru know of her and Rem's whereabouts, so if there wasn't any sense of unity between the marks, that was because became of his clues. There were many places where it was hard to find them. Quite possibly, while Rem worked to create traps, Louis, who was left by herself, was probably just doing as she pleased. That was probably the truth of the matter. The clues Louis left continued to be difficult to find for a while, but it was very helpful when he finally came across an obvious one. I'm glad it was left there. If Rem found it and erased it, the trail of clues could be cut off, he almost said, before taking a pause in his words. Then he returned to the tree he had been passed by, staring at where the bark had been peeled away. The tree was large and sturdy, and the bark was pulled off from a spot that rather stood out. Would Rem really fail to notice such a thing? Subaru... The part where he was confused by the footprints at the grassland, Rem gradually became proficient in her trap-setting skills, starting from there, and a large portion of bark being stripped from the tree in front of him in an exaggerated manner. The 3 combined themselves inside of Subaru's head, completing the puzzle of the odd feeling he had. Eventually, a single answer was derived inside of him. If it's the Rem I know. If it was Rem, who was tactful and good at being attentive, she would have definitely eliminated any plainly visible tracks. Since the clue was right in front of him and left alone, unless Rem had sunk into quite a state of tunnel vision. Ha! Towards the path he had tried to move past, Subaru ripped out a chunk of thick grass from beneath his feet and hauled it in that direction. The grass, with soil entangled in between its roots, drew a parabola as it flew at the patch of tall grass and, immediately after, the patch of grass made a terrifyingly gigantic sound as it plunged down. An enormous pit engulfed the earth. Whoa! A large hole materialized in front of him, almost making him wonder what other pitfalls from the minor traps were there for. Nevertheless, the trap didn't end there. Aiming for the huge pit that made its appearance, the surrounding trees creaked as they snapped apart and collapsed. The fallen trees tumbled into the large hole one after another, and the freshly opened pit was immediately refilled. If Subaru had fallen into that enormous pitfall, he would have been stuck and entombed there now, buried alive. Coming to this point, a daring, powerful technique had been executed, having used the other traps until then as a psychological trick. The clues that had been serving as a hint for Subaru's pursuit was waiting with its mouth wide open as a trap to bury him alive. He wanted to applaud Rem for being a measure that was very Rem-like, but the Rem I know wouldn't end it with this. If one set psychological traps, then the best result would be their pursuer falling for it and being forced to stop moving. However, the Rem he knew was attentive, a hard worker, had a cute face and voice, warmed his chest just by how admirable she was with her actions and... Subaru would initiate an attack if she got tired of waiting. Isn't that right, Rem? Subaru swam round after he said that, gazing up at the tree with its bark peeled off. It was just at that time, that Rem gritted her teeth, launching herself at Subaru from a branch of the very tree.